In this jaw-dropping 24-hour Senate speech, Senator Cory Booker goes to war for the forgotten generation, Americans 45 and older. He's not just talking politics. He's calling out the reckless policies that are threatening the very future of seniors and hardworking people over 45. With fiery passion, Booker rips apart Trump's broken promises, healthcare cuts, and the looming economic disaster that could wipe out everything seniors have worked for. This isn't just another speech. It's a battle for the soul of the nation. Booker lays it all on the line, demanding that America stand up and take care of its aging population. But here's the shocking truth. This fight isn't just about politics. It's about life or death for millions of people who depend on Social Security, healthcare, and a fair shot at retirement. If you're over 45, this video is for you. Senator Booker isn't backing down, and neither should you. Watch till the end to see why this speech could be the turning point for a generation that's been forgotten for far too long. Don't miss it. The longest fight you've never heard of. When Cory Booker stepped up to the Senate floor, the weight of history wasn't the only thing on his shoulders. He wasn't just breaking records. He was about to do something that would shake America to its core. The clock was ticking, and Booker wasn't about to let it run out before he made his case for the millions of Americans who had been left behind. People 45 and older who had fought for this country their entire lives, but were now facing the fight of their lives just to survive. You could feel the tension in the air as Booker launched into his speech. The room was packed, but his words were aimed squarely at the millions watching from their homes, the people over 45 who'd worked hard for decades, only to have their futures threatened by the very people who promised to help them. As the night dragged on, Booker wasn't just making a point. He was making a stand. For over 24 hours, he spoke for those who couldn't afford to speak for themselves. The seniors struggling to pay for their medicine. The baby boomers who had built this country, and now faced the cruel reality of seeing their healthcare stripped away. People who had earned their Social Security benefits, only to have them dangled like a carrot in front of them, while the wealthy got tax breaks they didn't need. It wasn't just a speech, it was an awakening. An awakening for people who had been ignored for too long. And Booker wasn't about to let that happen without a fight. He spoke of the deep gut-wrenching fear many seniors lived with every day. The fear of losing healthcare, the fear of losing everything they had worked for, and the fear that the country they had fought for would forget them. The stakes couldn't have been higher. This wasn't just about political games or another talking head on TV. Booker was laying it all on the line for a generation that had been promised so much and given so little in return. It wasn't about left or right. It was about right or wrong. And Booker was dead set on making sure that the 45-plus generation didn't get thrown under the bus just to line the pockets of the rich. As the hours ticked by, Booker's voice grew louder, more urgent, his passion electrifying. Every word was a battle cry. He wasn't just fighting for healthcare. He was fighting for the dignity of every American who had reached the age where their body begins to betray them, but their country should never turn its back on them. This wasn't some politician looking for votes or clout. This was Cory Booker standing alone in the Senate, making sure America heard the stories of its forgotten people, the ones who had given their best years, only to be told their time had passed. The ones who would bear the brunt of policies that favored the rich over the hardworking folks who had spent their lives building this country. By the time Booker finished speaking, the room had changed. It wasn't just a moment in history. It was the beginning of a fight that would define the future of a generation. And Cory Booker wasn't backing down. Neither should you. Cory Booker calls out the lies. And it's about time. As Cory Booker continued his marathon speech, it became clear. He wasn't just talking about policies, he was exposing lies. Not the usual political spin or vague promises, but real dangerous lies that were threatening the future of Americans over 45. With every hour that passed, Booker grew more resolute. The stakes were too high, and he knew it. This wasn't just about healthcare or taxes. This was about the future of a generation that had spent its whole life working, only to have their needs brushed aside by those in power. For decades, people over 45 had been sold a dream. The dream of retirement, healthcare, and a secure future. But now, all those promises were being chipped away by the very people who swore to protect them. Booker wasn't going to let that slide, not on his watch. His words cut through the noise, calling out every lie that had been told to this generation, and it hit hard. It wasn't just about Trump's empty promises anymore. It was about the fact that those promises were actively hurting people. People over 45, the ones who had been working since they were teenagers, were now at risk of losing everything they'd worked for. And Booker wasn't having it. With a fiery determination, he pointed out how the cuts being proposed would devastate those who were the most vulnerable, especially the elderly, who depended on their Social Security checks, their Medicare, and their pensions to survive. These weren't abstract numbers or statistics. These were real people. Your parents, your grandparents, your neighbors. Booker's frustration was palpable as he spoke of the broken promises. Trump had said he would lower healthcare costs. Yet, for millions of seniors, the cost of care was skyrocketing. The rich were getting richer, while the people who built this country were being asked to pay the price. For those over 45, the dream of a comfortable retirement was slipping further out of reach. And Booker wasn't about to let that happen without calling out the lies behind it all. The truth was, these cuts weren't just numbers on a page. They had real consequences. People were losing their health insurance, their jobs, and their dignity. Seniors were watching as the rug was pulled out from under them. And it wasn't just a small group of people. It was an entire generation that had been promised a better life, only to see that promise evaporate before their eyes. But Booker wasn't about to let them go down without a fight. As the hours passed, Booker's voice didn't waver. His passion only grew stronger, more focused. He knew the only way to fight this was to make sure the truth was heard loud and clear. And that truth was that people over 45 were being robbed of their future. He wasn't just talking about healthcare or taxes anymore. He was talking about justice for an entire generation that had been forgotten. It was a fight that had to be fought. And Cory Booker, the relentless fighter that he was, wasn't about to let anyone off the hook. The lies were exposed, the stakes couldn't have been higher, and this fight for the future of those over 45, was far from over. Booker had made his stand, and now it was time for the country to wake up. Cory Booker rips into Trump's lies, and the 45-plus generation feels it. As the hours ticked on, Cory Booker didn't let up. If anything, he became more relentless in his pursuit of the truth. His focus, exposing the lies that had been fed to the American people. Lies that had the most devastating consequences for those over 45, particularly seniors. It was becoming clear. Booker wasn't just speaking for the moment. He was speaking for a generation that had been misled, abandoned, and now faced the harsh reality of a government that seemed determined to take away what they had worked for their entire lives. Booker's anger wasn't just political, it was personal. The people he was fighting for were his family, his neighbors, his community. He knew firsthand the pain that comes with watching loved ones struggle, knowing that they had given everything to build this country, only to be ignored when it came time for them to retire and live out their golden years with dignity. And as Booker laid out the damage done by Trump's broken promises, it became clear just how much was at stake for the over 45 crowd. The central issue was clear. Trump had promised lower healthcare costs and a stronger economy, but the reality was far from it. The elderly, especially those who were over 45, were now faced with mounting healthcare costs, reduced access to care, and the very real possibility of losing everything they had worked so hard to save. And Booker wasn't having it. He spoke with fire, with a determination that demanded action. How could the country have fallen so far, he asked, when those who had given everything were now being left to fight for scraps? But it wasn't just about healthcare. Trump had promised to make America great again, to look out for the working class. And yet, the people who had worked their entire lives were now facing an uphill battle just to make sure they could afford a doctor's visit or their prescription medication. It was infuriating, and Booker wasn't afraid to call it out. He exposed how the wealthiest Americans were getting tax breaks, while the middle class and seniors were left holding the bag. For people over 45, the stakes couldn't have been higher. Every day, more seniors were being forced to make impossible choices between paying for their medication or paying their bills. Some were forced to delay treatments or live in fear of medical emergencies. What Booker made crystal clear was that these weren't just statistics, these were real lives. And the people who were supposed to protect them? They were too busy serving their corporate donors to care about the millions of Americans who were struggling to survive. Booker's speech was a rallying cry, not just for the Democratic base, but for every American who had been left behind by a system that was supposed to serve them. He wasn't just defending healthcare, he was defending the soul of the nation. People over 45 deserved better. They deserved a government that wouldn't abandon them in their time of need. As the speech dragged on, the pressure built, not just for Booker but for the nation. Every word he spoke was a wake-up call. Every truth he exposed was a reminder that the fight for the future of the over 45 generation was just beginning. Booker wasn't just calling out Trump's lies. He was calling out a system that had been rigged against the people who had given their lives to this country. And he wasn't going to stop until they got what they deserved. The fight was real, and it was just getting started. Booker had set the stage for a battle that would define the future of millions of Americans. And the truth was, if the country didn't wake up now, it might be too late for those who had already given everything. Cory Booker takes on the debt crisis, and the 45-plus generation pays the price. As Cory Booker's marathon speech dragged on, the focus shifted. It wasn't just about healthcare anymore, it was about something even bigger. The national debt. A debt that was ballooning faster than ever, and one that would ultimately fall on the shoulders of people 45 and older, particularly seniors who had worked their entire lives and now faced the prospect of paying the price. Booker wasn't pulling any punches. He was calling out the lies, the false promises, and the devastating impact the growing national debt would have on the very people who had already given so much to this country. Booker's voice carried through the Senate, cutting to the heart of the issue. The government's reckless spending spree, which disproportionately benefited the wealthiest Americans while leaving working-class families and seniors in the dust. The tax cuts for the rich, Booker pointed out, were just the beginning. The real danger lay in the long-term consequences, the crushing debt that would soon reach unsustainable levels and directly impact those who were already struggling. And guess who would be left to pick up the pieces? The 45-plus generation. For the seniors watching, this wasn't some abstract policy discussion. This was personal. Their pensions, their savings, their social security, they were all at risk. Booker made it clear that the policies being pushed through by the government were threatening the very future of the people who had worked the hardest and sacrificed the most. How could this be happening in the land of opportunity? The people who had spent decades contributing to the economy, raising families, and paying taxes were now being told they would pay the price for the country's reckless fiscal decisions. The fact that the rich were getting richer, while the rest were left to fend for themselves, wasn't lost on Booker. He pointed out how these policies were not only unfair, they were dangerous. The growing national debt wasn't just a number on a page. It was a real, tangible threat to the futures of millions of Americans, especially those over 45. And while the politicians in Washington kept playing games, it was the average American who would be left holding the bag. Every hour Booker spoke, the more urgent the situation became. He wasn't just warning about the financial crisis, he was talking about its human toll. For those over 45, many of whom were nearing retirement age, the consequences of a ballooning debt could be catastrophic. Their retirement savings could be wiped out. Their health care could become unaffordable. And the promises they had been given, the promises of security in their golden years, could be broken beyond repair. The idea that this was a problem that could be ignored or swept under the rug was something Booker simply wouldn't accept. He wasn't just fighting for the future of his generation. He was fighting for the future of everyone who had worked hard and deserved to retire with dignity. The message was clear. If the debt wasn't brought under control, it would destroy the future of an entire generation, leaving the 45-plus crowd to pick up the pieces. Booker didn't stop there. He made it clear that it wasn't just about the debt, it was about the priorities of those in power. While the wealthiest Americans were being showered with tax cuts, it was the middle class and seniors who would ultimately pay the price for the government's fiscal irresponsibility. This wasn't just about economics, it was about fairness, about justice for those who had done their part, and now deserved to see the government do its part in return. With every word, Booker sharpened the focus on what was truly at stake. The national debt wasn't just a financial problem, it was a moral one. And for the seniors who had given their lives to building this country, the consequences of inaction would be devastating. Booker wasn't just speaking to the Senate. He was speaking directly to the people who needed to hear this message the most. And he wasn't going to stop until they did. The fight wasn't just about balancing the books. It was about saving a generation. The 45-plus crowd had done their part. Now it was time for the government to do theirs. And Booker wasn't going to rest until that message was heard loud and clear. Cory Booker fights for the forgotten generation. The 45-plus crowd deserves better. As Cory Booker's marathon speech raged on, it became clear that this was more than just another political battle. This was a fight for the forgotten generation, the people over 45 who had been left in the dust by the very system they helped build. With every word, Booker was making one thing clear. The 45-plus generation wasn't going to take being ignored any longer. Booker wasn't just talking about policy. He was talking about the real lives of real people. His neighbors, his family, and the millions of seniors who had worked their entire lives only to watch their future slip away. He spoke about the crushing reality facing older Americans today. Healthcare costs that were spiraling out of control, the ever-present fear of losing Social Security benefits, and the struggle to keep up with bills when there were fewer and fewer safety nets available. The 45-plus generation had been promised so much over the years, and now they were being forced to fight just to hold on to what they had left. This wasn't just about statistics or numbers. It was about the families who were struggling to care for their elderly parents, the people who were facing the brutal reality of aging without the support they had been promised. It was about seniors in nursing homes, people with chronic health conditions, and folks who had spent decades paying into a system that was now threatening to abandon them. And Cory Booker wasn't going to stand by while they were left to fend for themselves. Every word Booker spoke seemed to carry the weight of generations. He didn't just want to fix the system for today. He wanted to make sure that people over 45 had a future to look forward to. He wasn't going to let the policies of the rich and powerful decimate the lives of those who had already given so much. And that's where his anger came from. It wasn't just righteous indignation, it was personal. Booker knew that his own family, his own friends, and his constituents were among those who were being hurt by the system. And he wasn't going to let them go down without a fight. The reality was hard to ignore. The 45-plus generation was at the mercy of a broken system. A system that had promised safety nets and protections, but was now doing everything in its power to cut them down. The tax breaks for the rich were only adding fuel to the fire, while the middle class and older Americans were left holding the bag. This wasn't just a fiscal issue, it was a moral one. Booker wasn't just a politician talking about a problem. He was a leader standing up for people who felt forgotten. He wasn't about to let the 45-plus generation become a casualty of political games. These were people who had built this country with their blood, sweat, and tears. Now they were being told to work even harder just to get by. And Booker wasn't going to let that happen. The tension in the Senate chamber was palpable. Every word Booker spoke felt like a declaration of war against a system that had failed the people it was supposed to serve. And Booker wasn't stopping until those people had what they deserved: healthcare, security, and the chance to retire with dignity. For the 45-plus crowd, the fight had just begun. But with Cory Booker leading the charge, they weren't going to be forgotten anymore. This wasn't just a speech, it was a turning point. And Cory Booker wasn't going to let the 45-plus generation down. The battle for their future was on, and Booker was in it to win it. Cory Booker calls out Trump's broken promises, and the 45-plus generation feels betrayed. By now, Cory Booker's words were echoing across the nation, shaking the very foundations of Washington. The truth was undeniable, and he was putting it all on the line, calling out the lies, the broken promises, and the devastating reality facing the 45-plus generation. And this time he wasn't holding back. As he stood there on the Senate floor, Booker knew the fight had reached a boiling point. This wasn't just about politics. It was about survival for millions of older Americans who had been fed a steady stream of empty promises. As Booker took a deeper dive into the heart of the issue, his anger was palpable. He wasn't just talking about abstract policies or political games. He was talking about the real consequences of Trump's broken promises. The seniors who had been promised a better life were now facing uncertainty and fear. People over 45 who had worked their whole lives were now staring down the possibility of losing their health care, their retirement savings, and their dignity. For them, the promises made during Trump's campaign were quickly turning into a nightmare. And Cory Booker wasn't about to let this slide. The healthcare system was one of the biggest lies. Trump promised to lower healthcare costs for everyone, especially for seniors. But what had happened instead? Prices were rising, coverage was shrinking, and millions of older Americans were left scrambling to find affordable care. The situation was a disaster, and it was only getting worse. For people over 45, many of whom were already dealing with chronic illnesses, the stakes were much higher. Booker knew that if something wasn't done soon, seniors across the country would be left without the medical care they needed to survive. But the broken promises didn't stop there. Trump's tax cuts for the wealthy were another major blow to the 45-plus crowd. The rich were getting richer, while the people who had built this country were left with nothing but empty promises. Booker made it clear that these policies weren't just unfair. They were actively harming those who had already given so much. The middle class, and particularly seniors, were being squeezed out of the system, left to fight for crumbs while the rich got tax breaks that did nothing for the rest of America. The pressure was mounting as Booker spoke. He wasn't just taking on Trump. He was taking on a system that had repeatedly failed the people who needed it most. The 45-plus generation, the people who had spent decades paying taxes, raising families, and building a future for their children, were now being told that their needs didn't matter. Booker couldn't accept that. And neither should America. For people over 45, the pain was real. Every day, more seniors were being forced to make impossible decisions. Pay for their medications or pay their bills, stay in their homes, or move into a nursing facility they couldn't afford. It was a brutal reality that many were facing, and it wasn't getting any easier. Trump's promises had failed them, and now it was up to people like Cory Booker to fight for a future where they didn't have to live in fear. The broken promises of the Trump administration weren't just political failures, they were personal. They were the lies that had devastated people's lives, especially those who had already been through so much. Booker's speech wasn't just about fighting back. It was about making sure that the voices of the forgotten generation were heard. For the people over 45, their fight for survival wasn't over. Cory Booker had taken up their cause, and he wasn't going to back down. The stakes were too high, and the future of the 45-plus generation depended on it. With every passing hour, Booker grew more determined. He wasn't just speaking for today. He was fighting for the future of an entire generation that had been left behind. The battle had just begun, and Cory Booker was ready to take on the fight for every American who had ever been promised more than they had been given. The stakes had never been higher, and the 45-plus generation was watching. They weren't going to be forgotten again. Not while Booker was in their corner. Cory Booker's emotional plea for seniors. Will America listen? As Cory Booker's filibuster stretched into its final hours, it wasn't just the exhaustion that weighed him down. It was the emotional toll of knowing just how many people were depending on him. People who had given their all to this country, only to be left vulnerable in their later years. People 45 and older, who had paid their dues, worked long hours, raised families, and now found themselves staring down a future that seemed more uncertain than ever before. Booker wasn't just fighting for political points anymore. He was fighting for their lives. It was in the final stretch of his speech that Booker got personal. For the first time, his voice cracked as he spoke about the people closest to him. His own parents, the ones who had worked hard their whole lives, and who now faced the very real consequences of America's broken promises. His eyes filled with emotion as he spoke about the crushing reality that so many seniors were dealing with. The fear of losing health care, the anxiety of mounting bills, and the terror of watching their savings dwindle away. But Booker wasn't just talking about his own family, he was talking about millions of families across America, especially those over 45, who were being pushed to the brink. Every single day, they were faced with decisions that no one should ever have to make. Can they afford their medications? Should they skip a doctor's visit to save money? Will they have enough to get through the month? These weren't just abstract problems, these were the questions real people, real families were wrestling with. And Booker wasn't about to let them be ignored any longer. The pain in his voice was palpable as he detailed the toll that aging in America was taking on families. The rising costs of healthcare, the ever-present worry about Social Security, the crushing weight of student loan debt, and the lack of real support for seniors trying to navigate a system that seemed stacked against them. He knew firsthand that people over 45 were often left to fight for themselves, whether it was trying to get a fair deal on their medications or struggling to keep up with an economy that seemed to leave them behind. But despite the weight of the fight, Booker didn't back down. He knew that if he stopped now, if he let the system continue to ignore the needs of older Americans, then the future would look even darker. The truth was, these weren't just issues for one group of people, they were issues for everyone. Booker wasn't just fighting for his generation or even the one before him. He was fighting for the future of the nation as a whole. A nation that couldn't afford to ignore the voices of its seniors anymore. The emotional crescendo of Booker's speech wasn't just for effect. It was a call to action. He wanted everyone listening, especially those in power, to understand the stakes. The 45-plus generation wasn't asking for a handout, they were asking for fairness. For the promises made to them to be honored. They had worked hard for their entire lives, and now they deserved a future free from fear, free from poverty, and free from the nightmare of wondering how they would survive in their golden years. Booker's emotional plea wasn't just about calling out the system. It was about showing the heart of the issue. He wasn't just asking for policy changes, he was asking for a nation to remember what it meant to take care of its own. And for those over 45, the stakes were personal. It was about their lives, their health, and their dignity. It was about a promise that had been broken, and Booker wasn't going to rest until that promise was kept. The final moments of Booker's speech left an undeniable sense of urgency hanging in the air. He had made his point clear, and now it was time for America to make its move. Would they continue to ignore the needs of the 45-plus generation, or would they take action to ensure that people who had given so much would finally get what they deserved? The fight was far from over, but Cory Booker wasn't going anywhere. Neither was the 45-plus generation, and with every passing minute, their voices were getting louder. It was time for change, and Booker was leading the charge. Cory Booker's final stand, the 45-plus generation's last chance. As Cory Booker's 24-hour filibuster came to a close, the tension in the room was palpable. He had spent nearly an entire day speaking for those who couldn't speak for themselves, America's 45-plus generation, especially its seniors. But this wasn't just another speech. This was a battle for the very soul of the country. Booker wasn't just raising his voice for political points or to grab headlines. He was fighting for the future of millions of hardworking Americans who were teetering on the edge, struggling to stay afloat in a system that seemed determined to leave them behind. The final moments of Booker's speech hit harder than ever before. His voice, though strained and exhausted, carried a sense of urgency that cut through the fatigue. This wasn't about healthcare plans or tax cuts anymore. This was about people. It was about the seniors and those over 45 who had worked their whole lives, only to be left facing a future full of uncertainty and fear. Booker's eyes locked with the camera as he made his final plea. A plea for America to do better, to remember the people who had built this country, and to ensure that their futures weren't erased by a broken system. The stakes couldn't have been higher. For the 45-plus generation, it wasn't just about political parties or ideological divides. It was about survival. Seniors across the country were watching, hoping for some kind of assurance that they wouldn't be forgotten, that their needs would finally be addressed. For so long, they had been promised the American dream, security in their later years, a chance to retire with dignity, and healthcare that wouldn't bankrupt them. Yet now, all of that was on the line. Healthcare costs were rising, Social Security was under constant attack, and the rich were getting richer while the working class and seniors struggled just to keep their heads above water. But Booker's fight wasn't just about exposing these injustices. It was about sparking action. His words were a call to arms for all those who had been marginalized by the system. He made it clear that this wasn't just a battle for older Americans. It was a battle for the future of the country as a whole. If America didn't start taking care of its seniors, then the entire nation would suffer. Booker's final message was clear. This is not just about the past. This is about the future, and it starts with us, taking action now to save what we can before it's too late. With every word, the weight of the moment became more and more evident. This wasn't just a speech, it was a turning point. Booker's relentless passion wasn't just inspiring, it was necessary. For every senior who was losing sleep over whether they would have enough money to cover their bills, or whether they would be able to afford their next doctor's visit, Booker's fight was their fight. He wasn't just standing up for policies, he was standing up for people who had already given everything and deserved better than to be cast aside. By the end of the 24-hour filibuster, Booker had accomplished what few could have imagined. He had made the entire country stop and think. The media, the public, even his colleagues in the Senate were forced to confront the reality of what was at stake for the 45-plus generation. Cory Booker wasn't just another politician. He had become the voice of the people who had been silenced for too long. And the truth was undeniable. Booker's words would continue to resonate long after the cameras stopped rolling. The fight for the 45-plus generation wasn't over. But Booker's stand had ignited something bigger. It was a reminder to everyone that the people who had built this country deserved a government that would stand by them, protect them, and fight for their future. For the 45-plus generation, it was no longer just a battle, it was a movement. And Cory Booker had led the charge. In that final moment, as Booker wrapped up his speech, he didn't just leave the Senate floor. He left a legacy. A legacy that would inspire not just lawmakers, but every American who believed in the promise of a fair and just society. A legacy that would remind the country that no one, especially the seniors who had worked tirelessly for decades, should ever be forgotten. The fight wasn't over yet, but thanks to Cory Booker, the 45-plus generation had found a champion. Now it was up to America to take the next step. The real question was, would they? Cory Booker's last stand, the 45-plus generation's future on the line. Cory Booker fought like never before, standing up for the 45-plus generation, the ones who built this country and now face a future on the brink. For 24 hours he held the Senate floor, calling out the lies, broken promises, and the ruthless policies that put seniors and hardworking Americans at risk. With every passing hour, Booker's voice grew louder, pushing back against a system determined to ignore the needs of those who had given everything. Seniors are being forced to live in fear of losing health care, fear of watching their savings disappear, and fear of being left behind. Booker refused to let that happen. His emotional plea was clear. America cannot forget its elders. Will the 45-plus generation finally get the justice they deserve? Booker's fight isn't over, and neither should our fight. Stay tuned because this battle is far from finished. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell to stay updated on more powerful stories like this. The fight for America's seniors continues. Join us.